I really think there's going to be some gold nuggets here for you. So welcome to the show, Morley. Such a pleasure to have you.
Delighted to be here.
A quote from your wonderful book, this book right here, which is, you said, in the same way that the sun is the center of the universe, I've come to regard ceruloplasmin, which is a compound we're going to talk more about, as the sun of our bodily universe of metabolic activity. So immediately in this book, you're positioning this compound, which relates to copper, as we're going to get into, as central to the story of human health and human physiology. And yet, in all of my 25 plus years of studying health science, I have never encountered this word prior to your book. So how is it that all of health science has been so misguided or so ignorant of this piece of the puzzle that you are talking about is so central to human health, copper and ceruloplasmin?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Great way to start the dialogue. I didn't believe it at first either. But there's way more to the story than we realized, and so I decided to dig in. And what you find out is that the Achilles heel of animal physiology, but certainly human physiology, is copper. It is the most important, but the most vulnerable part of our physiology, because it's very, very tiny. And in the world of traditional Chinese medicine, copper is the general and iron is the foot soldier. We don't have to be in the military to know there's a difference between a general and a foot soldier. And you don't have as many generals. Actually, in the US Army, I was so curious about this. There's 242 generals in the US Army by law. And there are 440,000 troops by law. It's like, okay, that gives us a good understanding of where copper and iron are, because there's 100 milligrams of copper in our body, and there's allegedly 5,000 milligrams of iron. 100 milligrams fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin, which is not a lot. And so, again, we have this incredibly important metal playing very strategic roles in the body. And there's only 4 things that copper does in our metabolism. Only 4. Creates energy, clears exhaust, catalyzes enzymes, and combats all enemies: bacteria, fungus, virus, and parasites. So we're talking about a very important element, very strategically important element. And who's funding the education of practitioners today? Big Pharma. And it has for many, many years, many decades. And what you find is, as you get into the research, again, I'm not as excited about the contemporary research as I am going back to 1910, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Amazing discoveries back then by luminary scientists. David Kylan. Have you ever heard that name? David Kylan?
No.
Okay. Well, David Kylan was Warburg's nemesis at Cambridge.
Oh, yeah.
David Kylan was the guy who figured out cytochromes. David Kylan was the guy who figured out that the mitochondria needed copper. And Warburg despised David Kylan, absolutely, with a passion. That the Nobel Committee is a club. It's actually a cult. And the people who get the awards are part of the club. The people that don't get the awards, not so much, right? And so a guy like David Kylan should have probably gotten 4 or 5 Nobels. But because he wasn't in the club, he didn't get them. And here's how he got into the Nobel Committee. When Peter Mitchell won his Nobel and was giving his address he's the guy who figured out oxidative phosphorylation. The title of his address, "In Memory of David Kylan."
Wow.
And what I find fascinating is we've got someone like Otto Warburg. He was only nominated 52 times for a Nobel Prize. And he only got one because Hitler said one was enough. Most people don't know that Warburg was a German. And he was protected by Hitler. In fact, the SS had actually come to take him away, and Hitler found out about it and released him with a personal letter. It's a fascinating bit of history, but the point is, what was Warburg's focus? He was all about three things. He only studied three things. Photosynthesis. He was obsessed with photosynthesis. He was obsessed with oxidative phosphorylation, and he was obsessed with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Those were his three dominant areas of interest.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote, hundreds and hundreds of articles about the mitochondria and about those three subjects. How many times did Otto Warburg use the word copper, or Kupfer, as he would have said in German?
Mm.
You can count on one hand the number of times he talked about Kupfer. From 1926 to 1930, a guy named Hans Krebs, you've heard of him, right?
Sure. Krebs cycle.
Right. Well, he worked for Warburg for 4 years
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning of his career. And what's really entertaining is to read the articles that they wrote. In 1927, they did a very, 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 very important study. And they took birds, pigeons, and geese, and they bled them almost to the point of death. And they wanted, because that was a true state of anemia. I would argue it is the only true state of iron deficiency anemia on planet Earth. Everything else is a scam. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But they bled the birds almost to the point of death, and they wanted to see how are these birds going to respond to that metabolic threat. And what blew them away, and it's in this article, it was published in 27, there was a threefold increase in copper enzymes in the pigeons and a sixfold increase in copper enzymes in the geese. It was an explosive finding in 1927. And the reason why it's important is that a year later, in 1928, in Madison, Wisconsin, Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and Elvium at the University of Wisconsin were denying rodents copper in their diet because they were just curious to see what would happen. If you took copper out of the diet, how does the body respond? And the rodents all developed iron toxicity in their liver. So we've got 27, hey, we take iron out and man, the body responds with copper. That means that copper regulates iron. That's what that research revealed, and they knew it. And what did they do with that research? They buried it under the rugs. And then 28, a year later, we've got this massive discovery about copper deficiency causing iron accumulation. And then in 2021, Kim and Gonzalez were studying genes that express in the liver to see if any of those 13 genes would have greater expression under a state of copper deficiency. And there was only one gene that fired up, and it's called ferritin light chain. And ferritin light chain gene is the gene that causes iron accumulation in the liver, and it does not require ferroxidase enzyme function to work. So it took a century to prove that they were right in Wisconsin. The point being that there were amazing discoveries from 1920s up through the present day that have never gotten scientific recognition. In 48, when Holmberg and Laurel discovered the ceruloplasmin protein that you're talking about, we're talking about one of the biggest proteins in the body, Ari. This is not hepcidin. We're not talking about insulin. We're talking about 1,160 amino acids.
Whoa.
It's not the biggest protein. It's one of the biggest proteins. And it's a tank because it's got 8 coppers inside it.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever seen the movie Fury, you know what I'm referring to. There are 5 soldiers inside a tank. And they all got to do their job. And all 8 coppers are needed to run ceruloplasmin. With ceruloplasmin is it has in the nucleus, it has 20 copper binding sites. Do you know even know what that means? It means that it can express 20 different functions.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're not talking about a VW bug here. We're talking about a Rolls Royce that can be a boat and a plane and a rocket. And I think the mistake that's made in a lot of practitioner circles is they've confused their training with the truth, and they're not the same. And the education that practitioners get is amazingly scripted. And who's running the show? Big Pharma. What's the engine? Sell drugs. And it's not, see, the thing is, what copper brings to our physiology and our immune system is sovereignty. Is Big Pharma about independence or dependence? And so when you're talking about a protein that can express many different enzyme functions, that regulates iron and oxygen, that prevents oxidative stress, which is the very harbinger of all chronic disease. When you've got a metal that runs the show, that's the general, what are you going to do? You're going to flip it. And you're going to tell people you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And be careful of that retinol thing, because it's going to cause vitamin A toxicity. And if people believe that copper is toxic and vitamin A is toxic, then they got a long way to go in their research to understand what's really going on. People need to know that I've renamed what COVID stands for. COV stands for coppers vanished, and ID stands for irons dysregulated. And those are the only, that's it. And when you understand what COVID does to our blood and to our immune system, it's all copper iron dysregulation. And the jab is COVID on steroids. But if you don't understand minerals, you don't understand what I just said. And so I think there's been a century-long campaign to downplay, to narrowcast the role of copper in the human body. And the changes that have been made in agriculture and food processing and pharmaceuticals is undeniable. NPK is a great way to block copper absorption, but glyphosate is a perfect way to block copper absorption because it chelates copper down to a pH of 1. What does that mean? Nothing stops it. It's a perfect copper chelator. Chelates other things too, but copper, I would argue, is the target. Within food processing, who are the two biggest salts? The biggest assaults were high fructose corn syrup. And what does high fructose corn syrup do? The work of Myra Fields and her colleagues at the USDA 70s to the 90s is that high fructose corn syrup blocks copper uptake in the front door, CTR1, copper transporter 1. And then the added assault within food processing is tyrosinase inhibitors. Tyrosinase, what is that? Well, it's the enzyme that's in the center of whole food vitamin C. It has tyrosinase enzyme at its core, and that has 2 copper atoms. Generation antibiotics, all the benzos, the cardiac drugs, again, they totally disrupt copper. What a coincidence. Isn't that interesting? That this lowly little metal that causes toxicity, well, we're going to get rid of it. And then what's the target in oncology treatment? Oh, well, that copper thing causes angiogenesis, and we've got to get rid of it. And they go to great lengths to use tetramolybdate and other agents to suck copper out of the tissue and ignore the retinol deficiency and the iron that's causing the cancer. But by gosh, we're going to get that copper thing.